A breaking update out of Minnesota is drawing renewed attention tonight after newly released footage surfaced from an ICE agent involved in this week's shooting. Supporters of the agent say the video clarifies the danger he faced in real time. Critics, meanwhile, argue it raises broader questions about how immigration enforcement is being carried out in major U.S. cities. The episode began in Minneapolis during an immigration enforcement action that quickly turned volatile. According to federal officials, an ICE agent discharged his firearm after a confrontation that involved a vehicle. A 37-year-old woman was fatally shot during the encounter. Within hours, the incident ignited intense public scrutiny and sparked protests, with community members demanding transparency and accountability. As the video circulated, Vice President J.D. Vance weighed in on X, pushing back on what he described as a misleading public narrative. In his post, he argued that many Americans had been told the officer was not struck by a car, was not under harassment, and had unjustifiably killed an innocent person. Vance claimed the footage showed a different reality, one in which the agent's life was at risk, and he fired in what he characterized as self-defense. Federal authorities echoed that position, stating the agent's actions were consistent with self-defense under the circumstances. The debate intensified against the backdrop of long-running tension over sanctuary city policies. Critics of Minneapolis's approach argued that local rules and political choices have made it harder for federal agents to remove individuals they consider serious public safety threats. They point to alleged cases involving violent offenses, particularly crimes against children, as examples of why agents sometimes return to communities to locate suspects who were previously released. Supporters of sanctuary policies counter that these measures are designed to increase trust between immigrant communities and local law enforcement, encouraging cooperation and reporting of crime. But what happened next, authorities say, went far beyond a single use-of-force incident. That one shot did not bring the operation to a close. Instead, it became the opening chapter in a much larger federal investigation, one that investigators say peeled back layers of criminal activity reaching across multiple states and potentially into local institutions. What began as an immigration-related action soon expanded into a sweeping law enforcement effort involving multiple agencies and a fast-moving series of raids. Investigators describe a major pivot point in the early hours of the morning. At approximately 3:12 a.m., in South Minneapolis, while most of the city was still asleep, unmarked federal vehicles approached a 14-story hotel near the interstate. The movement was deliberate and quiet, with headlights dimmed and teams positioning around key access points. Within moments, exits were secured. Elevators were halted mid-route. Stairwells were seized by tactical units moving quickly and cautiously, minimizing exposure as they advanced. Then the entries began. Doors were forced open with little warning. Flashlights swept through dark corridors. Agents issued loud, direct commands as they cleared rooms one at a time. Occupants were ordered to the ground with hands visible, and teams methodically moved floor by floor to prevent escape routes or blind angles. Officials say the entire operation unfolded with speed and coordination, producing results in under an hour. According to the account presented, agents from ICE, DHS, and the DEA detained 236 undocumented immigrants during the raid, with nearly 180 described as Somali nationals. Inside rooms and luggage, investigators report they found evidence of organized identity fraud, dozens of counterfeit passports, large quantities of prepaid burner phones, and hidden cash stashes concealed in unusual locations, including ceiling panels. As the searches continued, the scale of the discovery reportedly grew. Then the focus shifted again. Search teams say they uncovered dozens of firearms, handguns, as well as rifles described as assault style, some allegedly loaded and readily accessible. Investigators also reported narcotics seized from maintenance areas and locked suitcases, including cocaine and fentanyl, packaged in a manner consistent with distribution rather than personal use. Authorities claimed cash totals climbed into the millions, reinforcing their belief that the hotel was functioning as a hub for trafficking and distribution, not merely a temporary residence. In the view of the investigators, these discoveries reframed the entire mission. What had initially looked like an immigration-focused enforcement action, they say, quickly revealed itself as a high-risk criminal enterprise with an armed footprint. The presence of weapons, drugs, false documents, and large sums of money suggested a coordinated network operating behind closed doors. One that, officials argue, posed a serious threat to the city. By dawn, officials say the raid had essentially started talking. Phones collected from rooms kept lighting up missed calls, encrypted messages, partial delivery notes, and contacts that appeared to link people and places across state lines. Analysts worked through the night, attempting to map communications, match names to travel records, and connect burner phone numbers to physical locations. What seemed scattered at first began to organize into a clearer structure, implying a network that was not only active, but disciplined, complete with schedules, couriers, and logistics. And if investigators are right, this was only the beginning. The hotel raid did not simply close a case. It opened a larger one pointing toward multi-state operations, additional targets, and questions about how deep the network's influence may run. At the center of the case, investigators say, were two figures who didn't resemble the typical street-level suspects. One was a mid-career judge with a clean public image and deep roots in the community. The other was a licensed attorney in Minneapolis, known for handling immigration matters alongside criminal defense work. On paper, they looked like the kind of professionals who stabilize a city, credible, connected, and insulated. In the eyes of federal investigators, however, those same credentials may have made them uniquely positioned to operate as the network's strategic core. Based on material recovered from the hotel raid and additional locations tied to the operation, agents believe the pair spent years quietly constructing a pipeline that functioned on multiple levels at once. According to the investigative theory, migrants were moved into the United States, placed under manufactured identities, and then folded into roles that kept the enterprise running: drivers shuttling product and people, guards watching stash locations, and couriers moving cash and contraband with minimal visibility. Authorities say discipline inside the structure was enforced through leverage, financial obligations, intimidation, and pressure on family members abroad, tools designed to keep participants compliant and prevent defection. Investigators also allege the pair's professional status provided a form of operational shielding. Court access could slow the pace of certain warrants. Legal filings could complicate timelines and force delays. And if corruption was present, as agents suspect money and influence could move quietly enough to distort standard enforcement processes. In internal briefings, officials reportedly raised concerns that multiple layers of the system might have been compromised, from frontline functions to higher-level decision points, making it harder to isolate the network's footprint early. From there, the investigation's scope expanded rapidly. Authorities believe narcotic supply lines extended far beyond Minnesota, with product moving north through established trafficking routes and then dispersing outward across state lines. What initially appeared to be scattered violence, investigators say, began to look more organized once analysts mapped communications, cash movements, and recurring names. Incidents that had once been treated as disconnected standalone shootings, localized disputes, isolated seizures were re-examined as potential outcomes of a single structure operating consistently over time. As agents built out the picture, surveillance teams say they picked up a sudden shift in behavior consistent with flight. Mid-morning at Minneapolis Street, Paul International Airport, the two central targets arrived separately, carrying minimal luggage. Investigators noted a set of indicators they consider classic: newly issued travel documents, one-way international tickets, no visible legal team present, and no public explanation for the abrupt departure. To the teams tracking the pair, the conclusion was straightforward: if the case was tightening, the subjects were trying to exit before the net closed. Federal units moved quickly, using terminal cameras and other tracking methods described in reporting around the broader operation. Agents followed both individuals through the airport's controlled zones and waited for the moment before boarding procedures began. Then, in a coordinated approach, they converged. The arrest was over almost as soon as it started. No spectacle, no statements, no resistance, just handcuffs secured in the middle of a public space while travelers continued moving around them. With the alleged architects in custody, investigators say the network's protective layer weakened. Prosecutors approved expanded warrants within hours. Financial pathways that had been difficult to interpret suddenly became legible once key devices, accounts, and intermediaries were identified. Names that had stayed buried for years began surfacing together, rather than one at a time. In that moment, officials argue, the case stopped looking like a localized immigration enforcement matter and started reading like a national-scale conspiracy involving narcotics trafficking, document fraud, and institutional corruption. If you believe a network like this can only survive with help from inside the system, comment yes. And if you want every responsible party identified, no matter their title, hit like. Then came the next phase. Just before dawn, federal warrants reportedly went live across multiple states at the same moment, an approach designed to prevent suspects from warning one another, moving assets, or destroying evidence. Hundreds of agents staged in advance, and command centers coordinated real-time updates as teams moved in parallel. Roads were monitored, key locations were sealed, and entry teams executed searches with a tempo meant to overwhelm coordination on the other side. In one northern operation, a reinforced entry point was breached, and lookouts attempted to scatter. Flashbangs detonated, and the initial resistance collapsed quickly. In tight hallways, exchanges were fast and violent. Investigators reported that suspects resisted arrest, shots were fired, and at least one federal agent was injured and evacuated while the team continued clearing the structure. Minutes later, on the outskirts of Milwaukee, another target location, an industrial space repurposed for the operation's needs, turned into a confrontation. A suspect reportedly fired from an elevated position, forcing agents to take cover and adjust tactics before pushing forward. Agents responded immediately, returning fire and stopping the shooter before the situation could escalate further. When the teams pushed inside, they found what looked less like a stash spot and more like an industrial warehouse. Pallets of narcotics were stacked nearly to shoulder height, cocaine bricks wrapped, stamped, and sealed for resale. Fentanyl compressed and vacuum-packed in kilogram quantities, everything staged for rapid movement, not long-term storage. At 4:37 a.m., another wave hit South Chicago. Multiple teams made coordinated entries into an apartment complex spanning 3 different floors. The reaction was chaotic. Suspects bolted through stairwells, cut across rooftops, and tried to disappear into the building's maze of corridors. One opened fire blindly through drywall. Another attempted to ditch a weapon over a balcony railing before agents could close the distance. Federal teams locked the structure down, contained the movement, and shifted into deliberate clearing room by room, unit by unit, methodically removing threats and securing evidence. What they pulled from that complex underscored what investigators had been warning about. Rifles and handguns were recovered from behind walls, inside vents, and from concealed floor cavities. Bundles of cash were discovered in improvised compartments, designed to defeat quick searches. And by sunrise, the broader picture was impossible to ignore. Across 73 raid locations, teams encountered layered defenses, barricaded doors, early warning alarm systems, and weapons positioned for immediate use as if the occupants expected a raid and had rehearsed for it. In the first 36 hours alone, officials reported 4 separate firefights. 9 alleged cartel enforcers were killed while resisting arrest, and 2 federal agents were wounded but survived. The arrests climbed quickly. By the end of day 1, authorities said 412 suspects were in custody, including more than 260 identified as direct cartel operatives. Dozens more were detained on weapons violations, trafficking counts, and conspiracy charges. By the end of day 2, the total reportedly exceeded 640 individuals, many tied to interstate transportation corridors, armed enforcement crews, and money laundering cells that kept the operation funded and insulated. The seizures rose in parallel with the violence. Convoys rolled out carrying tons of cocaine, fentanyl, and methamphetamine. Safes were forced open, revealing tens of millions of dollars in cash. Hidden armories surfaced hundreds of magazines taped together for speed, ammunition stacked in crates, and weapons stored as if they were part of a standing inventory rather than personal possessions. Digital forensics teams cloned servers on site, freezing transaction ledgers and encrypted records mid-update, capturing the system as it existed in real time. What made the situation even more dangerous, agents emphasized, was proximity. Some targets were only minutes from schools and dense residential blocks. Drugs were stored in rooms that still looked like family bedrooms. Weapons were concealed behind false panels in ordinary houses. Every forced entry carried the risk of an ambush, or worse, a firefight with civilians nearby. By the second day, federal command described the conclusion in stark terms. This was not a local case and not a routine sweep. It was a hardened, interstate cartel network, armed, disciplined, and embedded deep inside America's interior, prepared to fight to protect its supply lines. Comment "Justice" if you believe this operation was necessary, and like this video if cartel violence should never be tolerated on U.S. soil. As the 6-state action wound down, investigators began rebuilding the timeline of what the network had been doing before the raids exposed it. The trail, they said, stretched far longer and ran far darker than expected. Financial records, encrypted ledgers, and witness accounts indicated the operation had been active for nearly a decade. What started as small-scale smuggling allegedly evolved into a high-throughput pipeline. Drugs moved north from Mexico and Colombia, crossed the border hidden inside commercial loads, and then spread outward from Minneapolis, moving through the region with the efficiency of a logistics system designed for speed, volume, and concealment. Even seasoned agents reportedly had trouble grasping the scale. Based on preliminary modeling and what teams were recovering across locations, analysts warned that the volume moved through this pipeline over the years could be staggering, potentially reaching into the hundreds of tons when aggregated across routes, time periods, and downstream redistribution. The product mix told its own story. Cocaine optimized for margin and rapid turnover, methamphetamine that entrenched dependency and control, and fentanyl cheap, potent, and catastrophic in its downstream effects. Investigators said the distribution model was engineered for reach. Shipments would arrive, be broken down into smaller loads, and then split again, pushed outward not only into major metro markets, but into smaller cities and rural communities across the Midwest, where detection risk was often lower and public health infrastructure thinner. In briefings, agents described it as a supply chain designed to behave like commerce. Predictable handoffs, redundant routes, and compartmentalized roles that kept the network resilient even when individual nodes were hit. The human cost, officials argued, was not abstract. Reviews of local health and emergency response indicators were cited as showing sharp increases in overdoses in certain areas over time, with some communities experiencing dramatic spikes over relatively short windows. Investigators and public safety officials pointed to patterns they said were consistent with fentanyl saturation. Sudden surges in fatalities, a widening age range among victims, and overdoses tied to counterfeit pills that users believed were something else. The damage, they emphasized, did not stay contained within criminal circles. It bled into schools, workplaces, families, and neighborhoods that were never equipped to absorb that level of shock. In parallel, authorities described a rise in violence that appeared to track with the expansion of distribution and enforcement activity. As drugs moved, guns followed. Local agencies reportedly documented increases in robberies, retaliatory shootings, and territorial disputes, violence that flared in parking lots, apartment corridors, and ordinary street corners, often with bystanders only steps away. In the federal telling, these weren't isolated incidents. They were symptoms of a market being defended and stabilized through intimidation. Witness accounts, investigators said, added a coercive labor component to the picture. Migrants brought into the country unlawfully were allegedly pushed into roles almost immediately. Drivers moving loads across corridors, guards watching stash locations, couriers handling cash and phones. Many officials claimed were trapped using a familiar toolbox. Fabricated debts, threats of exposure, and pressure routed through family ties abroad. Defection was discouraged not only by the risk of retaliation locally, but by warnings that relatives back home would pay the price for disobedience. And once embedded, leaving was presented as nearly impossible. Cooperation, investigators said, was enforced through fear more than loyalty. The narcotics themselves behaved like a contaminant. Fentanyl leaked into counterfeit tablets sold to teenagers who had no idea what they were taking. Cocaine money fed broader schemes, cash laundering, fraudulent businesses, and layered transactions meant to obscure origins. Meth kept users awake for days at a time, accelerating psychosis, destabilizing households, and hollowing out blocks already under strain. Social workers and outreach teams described neighborhoods where addiction advanced faster than any public health response could realistically follow, where treatment capacity was overwhelmed and prevention messaging arrived too late. Behind the scenes, investigators argued, the operation survived because it ran like a disciplined organization rather than a loose collection of dealers. Routes were rotated on a schedule, vehicles were treated as disposable, abandoned, and replaced to cut surveillance continuity. Communications shifted constantly. Burner phones, encrypted apps, coded language, short contact windows. When pressure rose in one county or city, loads were redirected overnight, exploiting jurisdictional seams and the slow pace of interagency coordination. The central point, federal teams claimed, was adaptability. The network adjusted faster than local agencies could remap it, until the hotel raid forced the system into the light and created a cascade of exploitable evidence. As analysts began quantifying the downstream damage, investigators said a pattern became difficult to dismiss. In their view, the overdoses were not accidents in the everyday sense, and the violence was not random turbulence. They were predictable outputs of a machine optimized for revenue, one that treated casualties as an acceptable operating cost. In internal discussions, officials circulated a sobering assessment. Tens of thousands of lives may have been touched directly or indirectly by the supply that moved through a single organization over years. And what made the case more disturbing, investigators said, was how long the operation appeared to function without being dismantled. It was not just concealment, they argued. It was camouflage protected by legitimate-looking structures, community credibility, and blind spots inside institutions that are supposed to create accountability. That assertion led to the most sensitive phase of the investigation. After the immediate arrests stabilized, the focus reportedly turned inward. What teams had quietly suspected during the raids, officials said now looked increasingly plausible. The network did not survive for nearly a decade on operational security alone. It endured, investigators alleged, because parts of the system meant to stop it were compromised. Interviews with mid-level operators began to align, according to briefings. The same names surfaced repeatedly. Payment timelines appeared to match financial records. Phone logs were said to connect certain officials to vehicles or movements that should have triggered enforcement scrutiny. In the investigative framing, corruption was no longer hypothetical or rumor-driven. It was being treated as a documentable thread, dated, traceable, and supported by converging sources. If badges and titles were used as cover, investigators warned, then silence wasn't neutrality, it was fuel. Over the next 72 hours, the operation shifted into a second, quieter front. While federal teams secured evidence and prosecutors prepared charging packages, internal affairs units moved in parallel, working the corruption angle in real time. Not weeks later when attention fades. Subpoenas went out with minimal visibility. Interviews were scheduled off calendar. Records requests were routed through narrow channels. The goal was containment, prevent leaks, preserve evidence, and identify compromised personnel before they could warn anyone else. Searches followed quickly. Lockers were opened. Duty bags were inventoried. Personal phones were seized under warrant. Home safes were accessed. The list of subjects expanded by the hour as data came back. Phone pings, bank deposits, unexplained cash purchases, and repeated contact with numbers already tied to the trafficking side of the case. By the end of the week, investigators reported that a dozen local officers had been taken into custody. The allegations varied, but the pattern was consistent. Small decisions that created large consequences. Some were accused of taking cash to miss traffic stops that should have turned into interdictions. Others allegedly passed advance notice of enforcement activity, just enough warning for targets to move product, rotate phones, or vacate a location before teams arrived. One allegation, prosecutors said, captured the brazenness of it. An officer reportedly admitted to escorting vehicles he knew were carrying narcotics, clearing intersections and controlling traffic under the appearance of routine patrol, effectively providing a paid security detail to a criminal shipment. Then investigators reached a name they did not expect to see on paper. A senior command figure still in office at the time of the raid cycle. Authorities alleged this official accepted recurring payments in exchange for redirecting manpower away from priority corridors and minimizing internal scrutiny when complaints surfaced. According to investigators, it was not a single favor. It was an arrangement predictable, scheduled, and protected by rank. What followed was the paperwork that makes corruption hard to explain away. Investigators said they recovered emails and archived communications, pointing to deliberate interference. Inquiries reclassified as clerical errors. Evidence routed into dead-end procedures. Complaints slowed until deadlines passed, and files that should have triggered action quietly buried under administrative language. To the public, the betrayal landed like a blunt instrument. Trust eroded almost overnight. Officers with years on the street found themselves questioned not only by supervisors, but by neighbors who had once defended them. Protests reignited not simply against enforcement, but against the realization that the system itself may have been used as cover. And according to prosecutors, it wasn't confined to policing. Financial audits reportedly exposed municipal officials who approved questionable contracts linked to shell entities and intermediaries. Consultants and brokers, some operating under legitimate-sounding titles, were accused of funneling vulnerable clients directly into the network's orbit. Administrative staff were alleged to have altered dates, corrected filings, or expedited paperwork in ways that helped targets evade scrutiny. Each act, on its own, could be dismissed as a mistake or a favor. Together, investigators argued, they formed a protective layer, small shortcuts stacked into structural protection. In closed-door briefings, prosecutors used one word repeatedly: ecosystem. Their point was blunt. This did not look like one bad actor or a few bribes exchanged in parking lots. It looked like an environment where corruption could survive inside routine, normalized through repetition, and justified as how things get done. The network, investigators said, paid for silence, and over time, silence became habit. The consequences landed immediately. Entire units were placed under external oversight. Pending cases were reopened. Past convictions connected to compromised officers were flagged for review. Careers ended in handcuffs. Reputations built over decades collapsed in days. For federal agents who had been exchanging gunfire with armed traffickers only hours earlier, this phase carried a different weight. It is one thing to confront violence from the outside. It is another to confront betrayal from within, but exposure had a tactical purpose. Investigators believed that dismantling the internal shield was the only way to ensure the organization could not regenerate. Once protection disappeared, routes stayed shut longer. Replacement drivers failed to move product reliably. Handoffs broke down. Without forewarning and official pressure relief valves, shipments stalled, alliances fractured, and internal trust corroded. The illusion of immunity was gone. What remained was accountability, slow, procedural, and unforgiving. In the weeks that followed, the city's atmosphere began to change in subtle, measurable ways. The noise faded first. Fewer sirens in the distance, less aerial presence at night. Corners that had been consistently active went quiet not because fear vanished, but because supply had been interrupted and distribution chains were no longer stable. Federal analysts said preliminary indicators matched what residents were already sensing. The flow had been disrupted close to its source. Hospital intake patterns shifted. Street-level seizures declined, not necessarily because enforcement slowed, but because product became harder to replace and networks splintered under pressure. Dealers who had operated openly either disappeared, moved, or turned on one another as trust broke down. Meanwhile, the legal fallout accelerated. Prosecutors filed waves of indictments tied to the organization charges spanning narcotics trafficking and weapons violations, as well as racketeering, human smuggling, money laundering, and public corruption. Several matters were designated high priority and moved quickly through federal court processes, reflecting the scope and the institutional risk alleged by investigators. For the two central defendants, prosecutors described as leadership figures, the fall was immediate and total. Authorities moved to freeze assets, lock accounts, and seize property linked to the enterprise, cutting off the financial oxygen that would otherwise fund legal obstruction, witness intimidation, or a reconstituted operation under new names. Assets were seized. Accounts were frozen, emptied under forfeiture authority, and meticulously logged into evidence systems that treat money the same way they treat weapons: chain of custody, serial numbers, audit trails. Courtrooms where a once respected official had previously presided became spaces where that same name was now spoken only in the context of alleged conspiracy, corruption, and abuse of public trust. A second defendant's professional standing unraveled just as quickly. Licensure and credentials were placed under suspension, with disciplinary proceedings moving toward the most severe outcomes. But investigators and prosecutors emphasized a point that was harder to quantify and impossible to contain within two defendants. The blast radius was wider than any headline. Families began to come forward in numbers that turned the case file into something closer to a record of grief. Parents described children lost to overdoses that arrived without warning, counterfeit pills, tainted substances, a single bad decision that became irreversible. Residents testified about neighborhoods that transformed over time. A slow normalization of violence, then sudden spikes, robberies, shootings, intimidation, until leaving felt like the only rational option. Migrants came forward with accounts that prosecutors characterized as coercion. Individuals who said they entered a system they did not understand, were pressured into roles they did not choose, and discovered too late that exit was not negotiated, it was punished. Those stories accumulated into transcripts, affidavits, and closed-session testimony. Line by line, they built a picture of long-term harm that could not be dismissed as collateral or coincidence. In court filings and briefings, officials framed the case not as a clean win, but as proof of how quickly a sophisticated criminal organization can embed itself when oversight weakens and everyday routines go unquestioned. Federal officials acknowledged the scale openly. Even with successful arrests and seizures, they argued, the operation was less a victory lap than a warning shot, a demonstration of how organized crime can exploit trust, appearances, and silence just as effectively as it uses intimidation. Violence can force compliance, but legitimacy can unlock doors, and in their view, the organization understood that. It did not rely on brute force alone. It relied on the credibility of institutions, on the assumption that titles signal integrity, and on the reluctance of systems to confront their own vulnerabilities. That silence, officials said, had finally been broken. In response, new oversight measures were announced. Joint task forces expanded. Data sharing procedures were tightened to reduce gaps between agencies. Internal review mechanisms were reinforced, and investigative protocols were updated to make interference harder and traceable. In public language, the reform sounded technical policies, audits, information pipelines, but the objective was straightforward: remove the seams where criminal networks hide, and reduce the dependency on individual discretion that can be bought or pressured. No one credible claimed the city was healed. Too many lives had already been lost. Too many communities had been hollowed out by addiction, fear, and instability. Some consequences, officials conceded, do not reverse on a timeline that fits a news cycle. Scars remain, and some never fade. Still, something fundamental had shifted. The myth of untouchability of power, status, and connections acting as insulation lost its grip. The belief that reputation could substitute for accountability collapsed under the weight of evidence, coordinated enforcement, and institutional exposure. What began as a single gunshot, officials said, escalated into an unraveling of a years-long structure that had operated in plain sight while remaining effectively unseen. For Minneapolis and for the surrounding states caught in the network's orbit, the message was hard but clear. The threat was real. The cost was staggering. And once the line was crossed, the response became comprehensive. When the last warrants were executed and the final evidence trucks rolled out, an unfamiliar mood settled over the city. Not celebration, not relief. Silence, the kind that forces people to sit with what happened and with what nearly happened. For years, danger had moved quietly through courtrooms, neighborhoods, and highways, concealed behind titles, paperwork, and routine decisions no one thought to challenge. The investigation, in this framing, did not only reveal a criminal enterprise, it exposed how close an entire system can drift toward failure, without a single dramatic moment announcing the collapse. That is the more uncomfortable lesson. Institutions rarely fail all at once. They erode. One ignored warning, one delayed review, one compromised decision rationalized as pragmatism, one file marked handled without being handled. The network, investigators argued, did not survive on violence or secrecy alone. It survived on comfort, on the assumption that authority should be trusted by default, and that scrutiny is an insult rather than a safeguard. That belief became its strongest weapon, and corruption, in the end, almost never introduces itself as corruption. It wears familiarity. It hides in professional reputations, in procedural language, and in closed meetings justified as routine. When oversight weakens, power stops serving the public and begins shielding itself quietly, incrementally. And until the damage is already everywhere. By the time the damage becomes unmistakable, communities are usually already absorbing the cost, quietly, continuously, and without the kind of attention that forces rapid change. The price shows up in addiction that spreads faster than treatment capacity, in violence that becomes background noise, and in lives lost without headlines, vigils, or sustained outrage. This case also punctured a dangerous myth, that crime only lives on society's outer edges. In this story, it wasn't confined to alleyways or back rooms. It was allegedly reinforced in offices, hidden in routine paperwork, and protected by decisions that looked legitimate on the surface, documents signed, files delayed, questions redirected. The most damaging roles were not always played by the people holding weapons. They were played by the people who opened doors, slowed consequences, and trained others to treat obvious warning signs as inconvenient details. Law enforcement can confront armed threats. What nearly broke this system, investigators argue, was betrayal from within. And yet, what happened next carries its own lesson. Once the internal shield was removed, once interference stopped and oversight took hold, the structure reportedly collapsed with surprising speed. Routes failed. Payments dried up. Protection vanished. The thing that had seemed durable for years turned out to be fragile when stripped of its insulation. Accountability, applied consistently and without exceptions, functioned exactly as it was meant to. Oversight restored momentum. Transparency became deterrence. The system did not heal overnight, and no one should pretend it did. But it began to defend itself again, less dependent on trust as an assumption, more dependent on verification as a standard. The warning now belongs to all of us. Justice cannot be outsourced to a title, a badge, or a uniform. It depends on vigilance, on refusing to accept silence as normal, and on having the discipline to question authority when facts no longer align with the story we're being asked to believe. When citizens disengage, corruption gains oxygen. When scrutiny fades, criminal power grows comfortable. And when comfort replaces accountability, institutions become vulnerable to capture from the inside. This story does not end with arrests. It ends with responsibility, because the next network will not look exactly like this one. It never does. But the conditions that allow it to grow are almost always familiar. Weak oversight, deferred consequences, and a culture that treats questioning as disloyalty. If you believe no badge, robe, or position should ever place someone above the law, comment, "Never again." If you believe accountability is the line that keeps society intact, hit like. And if you believe silence protects the wrong people, share this story so the warning outlives the moment.